Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third in a series of joint webinars hosted by AHDB and BGS discussing herbal leys. My name is Tom Goatman, and I'm the CEO of BGS. This webinar is part of a series of 4. The first meeting in July focused on delivering livestock performance and environmental improvements, whilst the second in September discussed establishment, looking forward to 2021. We hope you're able to join us on the 2 previous webinars, but if you're unable to, there are links to the recordings on the AHDB and BGS websites. Tonight we will be focusing on considerations beyond the price tag from both a research and practical farming perspective. We are pleased to welcome an excellent panel of speakers for the discussion tonight. After introductions, there will be a series of short presentations followed by a Q&A session where the panel will be happy to take any questions you may have around the points discussed. The webinar tonight will be recorded and the link made available. I'll now hand across to Steve West from AHDB, who will be facilitating the webinar to outline how it will be managed and introduce our panel. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Tom. So as Tom says, I'm Steve, I'm from AHDB. I want to just start by welcoming you tonight and just to explain how tonight is going to go. We've got a slot of just an hour between 7 and 8. If we're getting a lot of good questions, we may just stretch that by 5 minutes, so please bear with us because we really want to answer as many of your questions as possible. In the box on the right, you'll see an orange arrow, and if you click on that arrow, in there you will see a question box. If you click on that question box, you can ask any question. They will be anonymous. Nobody else can see them other than us, and we'll ask them without your name in place. So please don't be worried about asking anything that you think is daft, because I'm sure other people will be thinking of the same question. I'm going to ask the questions right at the end. We've got 4 presentations from 3 speakers today. We were expecting Becky Wilson from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, but unfortunately she was unable to make it to be with us tonight. So Hannah Jones, who's one of our speakers, will be covering her slides. So thank you, Hannah, for that. It remains really just for me to introduce our speakers. We've got an excellent panel tonight. To start with, I'll introduce Paul Newell-Price. Now, Paul is a soil scientist at ADAS, a chartered scientist and past chair of the British Society of Soil Science Professional Practice Committee, easy for you to say, with over 25 years of research and consultancy experience working on soil and nutrient management issues, principally in the UK, France and Morocco. He's led a number of applied strategic and policy-driven agricultural and environmental projects for the European Commission, DEFRA, devolved administrations and AHDB, and currently leads the European Horizon 2020 project on sustainable permanent grassland farming systems and policies, also known as Super G. This involves 21 organisations across 14 European countries. So welcome, Paul. Thank you. Next, we also have Hannah Jones. Hannah Jones is a Farm Carbon and Soils Advisor with the Farm Carbon Toolkit. She's previously taught crop sciences at Duchy College and at the University of Reading, supervised many students and carried out field research in areas associated with crop diversity. Most recently, she has been part of the SARIC-funded Diverse Forages team at the University of Reading and the Agritech Cornwall and Isles of Scilly funded TOMS project. Both of these projects have focused on quantifying the potential multifunctionality of herbal leys. Hannah's role in both of these teams has been to work closely with farmers and ag businesses to quantify herbal ley nutritional value and diversity, as well as assess soil health and floral resources for pollinators. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we have Rob Richmond. Now, Rob is a farmer speaker for today. Rob owns and manages a 280 cow herd at Manor Farm in the Cotswolds. The dairy there produces organic milk from multi-species swards containing 20 different species. The spring block calving cows are predominantly Friesian and shorthorn. The aim is to produce as much milk from forage as possible, reducing reliance in expensive bought-in concentrates. Rob undertook a Nuffield scholarship in 2010 and 2011, looking at soil carbon. This has formed the basis of how he works now, using high varied lays to provide constant ground cover and returning organic materials such as composted farmyard manure and slurry to the soil. So we'll kick off today. I'll hand over to Hannah, I believe. So Hannah is going to cover Becky Wilson's slides to start with, and over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I'll wait for my slides to appear.
They should appear any minute.
Okay,
second.
I look forward to it.
There we go.
Not quite there yet for me.
1 second. So a bit of a technical difficulty. We'll just deal with that. There we go. Okay. So they were showing Chloe. There we go.
We're on. Great.
We're on. We're gone. Over to you, Hannah. So apologies.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. So I'm talking on behalf of Becky Wilson, who's a colleague of mine today. Our particular focus in the Farm Carbon Toolkit is to look at carbon dioxide emissions, and we're going to use a herbal lays as a sort of focus to consider this on farm. So if you can consider diverse swards to a simple grass lay, first of all, you can see there's going to be immediate reductions in fertiliser use because of the introduction of legumes. But herbal lays, quite often we just think of white clover, but if you extend that across the diverse range of legumes that can be included into herbal lays, such as lucerne and sainfoin, you have potential to maintain that nitrogen fixation across a range of conditions, including drought conditions, which will obviously knock a white clover back very severely. Research, the second point here is recent research that was carried out by a New Zealand group, Luo et al. In 2018, has showed that the herbs can actually influence some of those nitrogen dynamics that are taking place in the soil. I think this is quite early days, but this research group found that plantain can actually reduce the loss of nitrates in the soil under waterlogged conditions. So this is denitrification, where nitrous gases actually enter the air, and very heavy greenhouse gas potential from those nitrous oxide emissions. So the plantain has a capacity to reduce the loss of those nitrous oxide gases, but also maintain that nitrate in the soil for use by the grasses for your sward. So in a diverse lay, of course, including those legumes, you have the potential to improve your feed quality, which I'll cover a little bit more in the next slide. Becky has, over a number of years, been involved in looking at the improved soil health benefits of herbal lays or more diverse swards, with particular emphasis on rooting depth. So once those roots go down below 30 centimetres or more, that layer of soil between about 30 and 50 centimetres is where there can be significant improvements in the carbon sequestration of your soils, which can actually have a long-lasting effect as far as total organic matter is concerned. So as I mentioned, with these diverse herbal lays, you can include species that can cope with drought. So a standard ryegrass, white clover, will suffer severely under some of the drought conditions we've experienced mid-season, but some of the farmers I've worked with particularly have been very happy for their stock to continue grazing on their diverse swards, which have been dominated by species like cocksfoot, plantain and chicory, and lucerne, which can actually cope with the drought because they are so deep rooting. Next slide, please. So some of the calculations and ballpark figures that Becky wanted to present today. So with a high legume sward, many of you are probably very familiar with the fact that it's not unreasonable to get 180 kgs of nitrogen per hectare fixed per year. And over 100 hectares, this is about 52 tonnes equivalent of ammonium nitrate. So not only so financial savings, considerable financial savings, as well as reducing your carbon footprint in the region of 146 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over that 100 hectares. So one of the main goals across the UK is to improve homegrown feed. So if we just look at diverse swards with those range of legume species in and grasses, if we look at carbon dioxide emissions, so a 16% crude protein, so CP stands for crude protein, equates to about 0.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So if you think about more on-farm forage production, you're saving money, but again, obviously reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So one of the key aspects of Herbal Leys is because of the diversity of species, you are unlikely to get that very rapid peak growth early season, which is April, May time, which is dominated by that really vigorous growth of perennial ryegrass, followed by some of the white clovers. But in the diverse swards, you're unlikely to get such a peak in growth at that time of year, but because of the diversity present, you will get later season forage availability, and in this way you can actually extend quite commonly the grazing season and also reduce buffer feeding. So each week your stock stays out, you can reduce your carbon footprint by about 0.35 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for a 100 cow herd, staying out for one more week, you're saving about 35 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And finally, as I briefly mentioned in the previous slide, those deep rooting plant species can sequester a lot of carbon that can stay in the soil for a much greater length of time because of those deep rooting capabilities. So when thinking about Herbal Leys, there's a real story coming out as far as the organic matter and carbon dioxide emissions across the farming system. Okay, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Hannah. That's fantastic. So we're getting questions already that are coming in, which is fantastic. Please do keep them coming. I'll put some of those to Hannah when we've got through the rest of the presentation. So thank you, Hannah. We'll hand over to Rob, and Rob, over to you.
Yeah, could someone just put my camera on? I can't find that. Perfect. Right, I want to follow on really from that, but from a practical point of view. Interestingly, Hannah said about storing carbon at depth from 20 to 30 to 50 centimeters. I struggle to find enough soil to dig a hole 30 centimeters deep on our farm with shallow soils over limestone. But what we have achieved over 12 years is shown in the photo there. That is 12 inches of evenly dark soil. When we started, the top 3 inches had a light brown color. Everything below that was a limestoney yellow color. With 12 years of grazing Herbal Leys, there's now 12 to 14 inches of dark soil, which is a huge amount of carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. So to achieve this, we've got to focus on managing photosynthesis. Can we go? So photosynthesis is governed by the amount of leaf area on a plant. The more sunshine we can harvest, the more carbon dioxide and water we can turn into sugar to grow a plant. A plant is 95% carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and only 5% other nutrients. So most of it is coming from carbon dioxide and water driven by sunshine. Rotational grazing these swards, increasing leaf area of the plant, produces more sugar. This produces more growth, and as the plant gets bigger, it produces a surplus of sugars, which it then feeds to the soil organisms. These use some of that for respiration, but some of that sugar is built up into stable carbon compounds and stored in the soil. If we look at the next slide, that shows this in a diagrammatic format. Next. So at the top of the slide, we've got a plant straight after grazing, very little leaf area with a decent root system. As that plant starts to regrow, as we go around to the right, that leaf area can't feed the whole root system, so some of that peripheral root system is shed off. And then as the leaf area continues to expand, it starts to reboot those root systems. With a ryegrass plant, each of the first 3 leaves is reproduced in the same time scale. The first leaf contains 15% of the dry matter, the second leaf 25%, and the third leaf 60% of the dry matter. That shows the difference as you get more leaf area, capturing more sunshine, producing much more growth. With the ryegrass sward, you go from the bottom right-hand corner back to grazing again. But with these diverse swards, we can maintain quality up to a much taller stage of plant growth, so enabling us to grow a lot more leaf area on the field. This leaf area captures a huge amount more sunshine, fixes a lot more carbon, and that then feeds the soil and builds the soil carbon. And that is how the whole cycle works. And grazing that plant before it starts to set seed and rebooting the cycle helps keep as much growing leaf area on the field as possible through the year. If we look at the next slide. So by doing this, you're managing to grow your soil rather than spending it through fertilizing it. Next slide. The results, a huge amount of carbon sequestration. The more I look at what we've achieved over the last 12 years with Herbal Leys, I think that 25 tons carbon dioxide per hectare per year is becoming more and more conservative. We've massively increased pasture production and quality, growing far more pasture, much more reliable, especially in the couple of dry summers we had, than what we could ever do with nitrogen and ryegrass. It's improved water management. These soils are much more friable, much more open. They're absorbing rainfall, holding on to rainfall, and the plant's able to access that extra moisture in dry periods and keeps growing much, much longer than it used to do. The soil mineral balances in the forage are improving over time, and it's having a huge beneficial effect on wildlife. So going forward with what they're talking about for the new subsidy schemes, these pastures tick all the boxes. Next slide. So what we're achieving through all this is capturing the sun to create soil, create ecosystems, and most importantly, create production. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you. We've got a load of questions that are still coming in for you. So thank you very much for that. I'll ask those to you in a moment when when Paul's finished his piece. But in the meantime, for the audience out there who thought they were going to get away without with just listening, we're going to ask you to do something now. So we've got 3 polls in today's today's webinar. The first of which is, how much do you spend on nitrogen fertilizer per year? This is what we'd like to know from you. You should see a blue screen that flicks up now with the question on, and you should be able to select one of those areas, one of those tick boxes. So we'll just leave you for a moment to just have a bit of a think about what that amount might be. I can see we've got people are voting, which is great. And we're just going to there we go. We're just getting there. Hopefully that's going to work. So there we go. Right, so hopefully you can see that. I know it can be a bit clunky. So by the looks of it, most people are spending, hang on if I just close my screen. So 27% are at the 60 to 120 pounds per hectare per year. We've got around the same amount, 22, 23% for 30 pound per hectare and 30 to 60 pound per hectare per year. Those that are above 120 hectares per year, clearly we've got the right audience there. We're down to 7%, but I know how that can happen, and then we've got 23% who are organic. So fantastic. I think that does shed a bit of light on some of the audience out there, so we can all see where we are. So what I'll do now is I'll invite Paul to come to the stand, and we'll hand over to Paul for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Interesting poll there. Looks like we have a representative audience tonight, with perhaps fewer organic than the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice would suggest. But anyway, yeah. So for this evening, I'm sort of cheating a little bit because I'm talking about herbal leys, but I'm also talking about multi-species swards within a permanent grassland context, because I think there's a fair bit of fluidity on farms and people interested to know about herbal leys with an arbor rotation, but also multi-species swards within a sort of more of a permanent grassland situation. So it's from a sort of Super G, the Sustainable Permanent Grassland project perspective, as well as the herbal ley perspective. So yeah, there's all sorts of benefits or potential benefits with herbal leys or multi-species swards. I just want to touch upon the carbon story initially, and then I will come on to the nitrogen fixation and sort of benefits for livestock performance. But just wanted to put some of the sort of carbon benefits of herbal leys and multi-species swards into perspective, really, into context. And I think there's no better sort of evidence for this or sort of data for this than from the long-term experimental sites. One of the principal ones being at Rothamsted and Woburn, and these diagrams here are courtesy of David Paulson from Rothamsted Research. So yeah, the potential for sequestering carbon, so storing carbon, adding more carbon to your soil, it depends on your soil type a lot, and your sort of initial conditions, where you're coming from, where you're hoping to go to. So in this situation, we've got Highfield, 3 different fields, Highfield and Foster's. They're both silty clay loam soils. And then at Woburn, you've got a sandy loam soil, slightly lighter soil type. And here along the x-axis, you'll see number of years, and it just shows how long it can take to change the carbon content of soils normally. Now for Highfield, the situation here is where we're going from a field which had been in grass for over 100 years. And then the management was changed. So we've got, in one situation, the triangles represent a situation where they were trying to improve productivity by sort of adding a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer and a bit of a reseed. So more productive grassland, you'll see the triangles there resulted in an increase in carbon over 40, 50 years or so. You're getting a slight increase in carbon, and then it sort of plateaus out. The other treatment was it going into an arable rotation, where you get a fairly rapid reduction in the amount of carbon in the soil due to basically there being part of the year when there's not a crop growing. Basically, if you've got continuous vegetation cover, you're photosynthesizing a lot, and you're storing quite a bit of carbon. And basically, the balance between photosynthesis and respiration is pretty good. As soon as you start removing the crop in an arable situation or a bare fallow situation, you lose a lot of carbon, as that chart on the left shows. The Foster's situation is slightly different. The starting point there is the field had been down to arable for a long time. It shows there that when you put it down to grassland, you can get quite a relatively rapid increase in carbon content. And that's the sort of situation we've got at Rob's farm, Rob Richmond's farm, where he's able to sequester a lot of carbon very quickly. And by using the Herbal Leys or the multi-species swards, he's probably accelerating that process. So doing it as quickly as he possibly can. Again, at Foster's there, you see when it continues in the arable rotation, you continuing to lose a bit of carbon, but it does sort of stabilize out. It does reach equilibrium eventually. The last chart there on the right is Woburn, which demonstrates what happens when you're in a sort of lay arable rotation. So it just shows with the lay rotation. So this is three years of grass followed by 2 years of arable. You start to get this sort of slight increase in carbon content, or at least you get stabilization of the carbon content, but it's relatively low level of increase, not as spectacular as when you're putting it down to grass or a sort of long-term multi-species sward. When it was left in the arable rotation, you continue to lose a bit of carbon there. So this just shows different perspectives depending on your soil type, your starting point, and the land use. The thing to remember here is that in all of these long-term experiments, they're just looking at the top 23 centimeters of soil. So we've heard already that we need to think about the whole soil profile, because the soil stores carbon right down to a meter or so. But in terms of perspectives of this, what can we do with our grasslands first of all? If we just forward the slide, Chloe, to the next image. Lots of people have been thinking about this, and Pete Smith at Aberdeen's given an opinion piece there. Do grasslands act as a perpetual sink for carbon? So can we continually store carbon in grassland soils in the long term? If we go on to the next image, his conclusions from the Rothamsted data is that the answer is probably no. If we consider that, if we're just considering that topsoil layer, not considering the layer below it, the evidence suggests that eventually you do reach this new equilibrium, a plateau. But we want to look into this in a little bit more detail to see what the effects are further down. So that's what we're doing in the Super-G project. If you look at the next image, it's an image of the Leys plots at Newcastle University. We were hoping to sample these plots down to a meter with samples every sort of 5 centimeter depth to see what the different treatments across these long-term plots. This is another long-term experiment been going on for over 120 years, I think. And there's various treatments on these plots, some with farmyard manure, some without, some with nitrogen fertilizer, some without. We want to look at the long-term effect of those treatments on soil carbon to depth, because that's a very important question. And if we just move on to the final image of this piece, just again to put things into perspective, we can do quite a lot with Herbal Leys in an arable rotation, but it's limited in terms of what we can do. If we're going from arable to grassland or arable to multi-species swards, we can get quite spectacular increases in carbon content, but we probably can't compete with natural forests. The evidence suggests that the best way of removing atmosphere from the carbon is by restoring natural forests, and this is just a title from a paper in Nature last year, I think it was. So yeah, but if you've got woodland, or if you're thinking about planting woodland, the best time to plant woodland is 30 years ago. So that's why DEFRA is putting quite a lot of store in sort of existing woodlands and planting new woodlands, because that can also help. So just move on to the next slide. Having talked quite a lot about carbon, I'll just quickly whisk through these few slides or few images. So this is just looking at the nitrogen replacement value of herbs within herbal leys and multi-species swards. That first chart is just one chart from a series of experiments we did for DEFRA a few years ago. We were looking at the issue of compaction in grassland and what deep rooting herbs and legumes can do for that. And we had 4 sites in England and Wales. This is just one of the sites at Bicton College, which is a sandy loam site, light soil. But it's just quite a good example of the benefit we got in terms of yield from deep rooting herbs and legumes. This was a 14 species mix. And the yield from first cut, you can see there, basically it beat the yield we got from the original sward, so ryegrass sward, where 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare had been applied. So that's just for first cut. And as we've heard already, we can get up to 100 to 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare fixed by these multi-species swards that contain legumes. That's one sort of clear benefit. Question is how to manage these multi-species swards or herbal leys, and the next image just shows some results, some more recent results from some work we're doing with James Drummond at Leamington Hillhead Farm in Northumberland. And James is very interested to know how to manage his multi-species or grass swards that have had herbs and legumes added to them. And how to manage them from a nutrient management perspective, but also in terms of trying to improve the persistency of the herbs in the sward. So we're looking at, we've sown a variety of species with James's help. We're also looking at the effect of phosphate, nutrition and nitrogen fertilizer, and whether adding nitrogen fertilizer right at the start of the year can help performance in terms of the sward, but also the livestock performance. It was just interesting to see here that nitrogen added at the start of the season helped the protein content in the sward to quite high levels of crude protein. But you also have to bear in mind by adding that nitrogen, we are slightly increasing our carbon footprint as well, so it's something to bear in mind. But from a productivity angle, it might be an advantage in that it helps livestock performance. And then the final image just takes us on to that subject of the livestock performance, which is the key issue really for the herbal leys and the multi-species swards. How does it affect daily live weight gain, livestock health, and the overall performance of the farm? So here we had 5 blocks, each with a different sward mix. So we've got a sort of standard grass clover plantain mix, and to that we've added in one block we added sainfoin, in the next block we added bird's foot trefoil, and then in the final 2 blocks we had bird's foot trefoil and sainfoin, but with slightly different seed rates. And it just showed that where we'd added the bird's foot trefoil, we had the best live weight gains, and James was very kindly doing the weighing on and off of the lambs. This is the live weight gain up to 8 weeks of age, and that benefit carried right through to weaning. So by sort of weaning, there's a sort of 5 kilogram advantage from the lambs that were on the bird's foot trefoil, and basically on the blocks that had a better herb content. So he's pretty convinced that it's affecting his animal performance, improving the animal performance, which also affects carbon footprint, but also business performance. And it's good for animal health because it's preventing intestinal torsions that he can get with his livestock. Certainly gets from the sainfoin, and he thinks there's an effect from the bird's foot trefoil as well. So just a few examples of the benefits that we can get from sort of herbal leys and multi-species swards. So I'll leave it there.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. Right, I can hear myself, so you might just have to mute yourself. There we go. Thank you, Paul, and I'll hand back over to Hannah, if I may.
Okay, hello again. The next few slides are going to be a combination of the results from the Duchy College-led TOMS project, which is Agritech Cornwall and Ailsa funded, and the University of Reading-led Diverse Forages project, which was funded by the SARIC Club. But I'll just interchange between those two. Okay, if you could press next slide, please. When we think of herbal leys, across the farming systems that I've worked with, we haven't picked out a significant effect of yield or quality when comparing herbal leys to a farmer's standard ley, which is commonly a ryegrass white clover ley, or comparing it to our control in one of the projects, white clover ryegrass ley. So why would you grow them if there's no benefits as far as yield and quality is concerned? So one aspect is to look at what effect do herbal leys have on foraging resources for pollinators. So in this slide, can you press the slide, please? Go back, they're animated. Go back, please, thank you. Just press once. Perfect, thank you. So in this slide, we've got one of the field trials. On the left is the herbal ley, and on the right is the white clover ryegrass ley. And if we actually look at the total number of flowering units, next slide, please. There we are. Across the season, across 8 different farm systems, the total number of flowers in the herbal ley, which is the largest fragment of this plot, there's more flowers in the herbal ley compared to the farmer's control leys, which varied with the farmers, but also with the binary, which we call the ryegrass white clover ley. But when considering resources for pollinators, it can be a lot more complicated than this. Different flowers have different quality as far as their pollen and nectar, and also time of year is very important as well. So early data in collaboration with the bee steward team of the University of Exeter at Tremo started to pull out that the herbal leys have a disproportionate benefit to pollinators because of their early season and late season flower presence. Early season, they're particularly important for the founding bumblebee queens, which they need to feed themselves before they can actually establish a nest. Okay, next slide. Thank you. One of the questions that quite often comes up when I talk to farmers about herbal leys is a big issue about weeds. How can you control weeds when there's all these broad-leaved herbs within the leys? So within the TOMS project, just considering the swards across the farms, a wide diversity of farms, some just cut systems, some grazed and cut, there was just under 10% reduction in the presence of grass weeds within the herbal ley compared to the binary and control. And in some farms, the effect was much more dramatic. Can you press the slide? Just once, please. So in this picture, you can see on this organic farm, on the right-hand side is the herbal ley, and on the left-hand side is the ryegrass white clover, and there's quite considerable suppression of the thistles in that system. Okay, next slide, please. So we've already heard some benefits as far as slides are flicking. Can you go back, please? Thank you.
Sorry about this. I don't know what's going on with my technical difficulties. I'll just try and get back to where we were.
It's okay. Okay, thank you. So we've already heard about the considerable benefits as far as soil carbon sequestration as far as diverse sward is concerned. There are a range of other benefits that are sort of being unpicked as far as the soil carbon toolkit is concerned, and within the sort of final stages of results and the projects I'm involved in. But I've just pulled out one set of data. If you can press the next slide, please, if it will work. Next slide. Okay, so this data comes from the Diverse Forages project. So here we looked at the total number of worms and worm weight across 4 different replicated trials from the southwest, Northwick, all the way through up to Reading, comparing the control, which was perennial ryegrass with 250 kgs of nitrogen per year, compared to 3 other herbal lays of increasing diversity in the yellow, the green and the blue. And what you can see is there was a significant increase in the number of worms in those herbal lays or diverse swards compared to the simple perennial ryegrass controls. Okay, next slide, please. So an additional question that we wanted to ask is, does sward diversity affect the nitrate leaching? Serious consideration, particularly in some of our farms are in catchment sensitive areas. So for this, some lysometers, I put some lysometers in the ground perpendicular to the soil surface, so they were down to about a depth about 40 centimetres. Could you click on to the next slide, please? So this is lysometer in the field, and this was carried out on replicate treatments across 4 farming systems in the diverse sward and in the control, which was the binary, the ryegrass white clover, and we assessed the nitrate in that leached water over the early winter of 2019. Next slide, please. And what we are able to find is by looking at the mean nitrate in the control compared to the herbal, there was a significant reduction in the leached nitrate in those herbal lays compared to the control, which was a perennial ryegrass white clover. There were 4 farms, and on the bottom you can see an NW farm and a TW farm, and both of those farms put slurry on in September, and these effects were detected over the period of sort of mid-November to mid-December. Next slide, please. Okay, so when considering herbal lays, even though it's difficult to unpick real differences in mean forage yield or forage quality, there are some significant advantages that across the board many different projects are trying to unpick, and so I present some of them today. Okay, thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Hannah, and I'll welcome all our other speakers back to the room if we've got them. We've got loads of questions, so I hope you're all poised. Please do keep them coming in, though. We'll get to as many as we can. So I'm going to ask the first question. Actually, I'm going to go back to Paul, if I may. How do you accurately measure soil carbon on carboniferous soils when an LOI test will result in loss of carbonates? Paul, you might be on your, I think you're on mute. 1 second.
Right, to try again.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So yeah, the most reliable method, well, it's either what used to be the Walkley-Black method, which has now been banned for health reasons. So now it's the dew-mass oxidation method. So with loss of ignition, yes, you do lose all the carbon in the soil, including the interstitial water and the clay. So it can exaggerate the amount of carbon that you're measuring. So yeah, the dew-mass method is the best one, but we tend to, yeah, so certainly on the research projects, we tend to do loss of ignition and dew-mass, so we can build up a sort of comparative database of levels.
Brilliant. No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Paul. We'll go to Rob now, if we may. So during the dry periods in the last few years, which on your herbal lays performed the best?
Primarily the older lays held on best of anything. They recover earlier in the spring. They held on through the dry, and as soon as there was moisture, they recovered. But I think that's because 1, there's more soil carbon. 2, the soil ecosystem is better established, and and those pastures, time after time, even though they're becoming grass dominant, but we're sowing 9 or 10 different species of grass in these mixes, and in time we'll lose the herbs, we'll keep the legumes, especially the trefoils, the samfoins, and the older Leys are always the more resilient and much more productive than the young Leys are far more diverse, but when they're really pushed, it's the older Leys that hang on much longer.
Okay, no, well, thank you, Rob. I've got another one for you then. It's sort of semi-related. Are your herbal Leys all permanent or temporary, and do you re-establish periodically?
Yeah, a bit of both. There was some really good productive Leys. The oldest one had been down 12 years and still very reliable, very productive. Other Leys become less productive and will be replaced every sort of 5 years, grow some whole crop, a turnip crop, and then reseeded back into another Ley to keep some young and some old Leys going all the time.
Lovely. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. We'll give you a break for a second, Rob. We'll go to you, Hannah. The next question is, there's lots of focus on drought tolerances, which is great. Are there any herbal Ley options for very wet farmland that are increasingly tolerant to wet weather soils? Wet weather and soils, I should say.
Yeah, so as a rule, the fescues are very good for wet soils, and I've seen white clover thriving under pretty soggy conditions. So as a rule, a fescue dominated sward, but if it's new ground, I'd probably cast the net wide and sow a very diverse sward, and then see which ones start dominating in that particular area of the field. Because quite often fields are very patchy and you might get a very wet area or a dry area, and so a herbal Ley, the composition will adjust to those different conditions. But yeah, but go for the fescues.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I've got quite a general question here, actually. It's about a specific situation of a farm that is rotationally grazing a spring calving dairy herd at 3.5 LU or above. So relatively intensive, but would a herbal sward be able to withstand this intense grazing? Now, it's anybody who wants to put their hand up to answer this. I'm interested to know all of your views.
Yeah, I'll have a go.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, these Leys in the spring, growing organically on a very difficult farm at 800 feet on the Cotswolds, we could be grazing on a 18-day round early season to keep up with grass growth up through sort of May, June, and then extending that later in the year. Organically, that platform was being stocked at 2.5 livestock units a hectare anyway on that farm. So on good land and slightly warmer, then yeah, these Leys could stand it as long as it gets those rest periods where it needs it. But it can tolerate hard work, definitely.
Fantastic, Rob. I don't know, Paul or Hannah, have you got anything to add on that?
I've got, is that right?
Yeah, of course it is. Yes.
I've got more experience of the swards in the southwest. I found those that most successful are systems that rely on slurry, very specifically slurry. The swards become really white clover dominated up to 80% in the worst conditions without slurry application to give that grass a boost. So grazing heavily, make sure there's appropriate nutrition coming into the system as well.
Excellent. Lovely. Brilliant, Paul. Has that covered what you wanted to say, or is...
Yeah, I think so. I was just a question of what I mean, you're talking about stocking rate at sort of at the farm level, which ultimately depends on, you know, how much nutrition the animals are getting, and obviously that can be increased through adding nitrogen, but that's not necessarily the most resilient way of managing things from a business or environmental point of view. But in terms of the management of a sort of tall grass sward in rotation, it really just depends on the interval, grazing interval, really, and providing you can allow the grass to rest for long enough, then herbal lays, I would have thought, could be incorporated to some degree in any system.
Oh, I see. No, that's fair enough. Well, actually, related to that, Hannah, what were the actual stocking densities that you used on that trial?
It was farm-based, and I wasn't given the precise densities on those. But I just wanted to add, when considering high productivity, we've talked about the nitrogen efficiency of these herbal lays because of the legumes, but you do actually have to keep a really close eye on the P's and K's when you've got that level of offtake.
Right, you are. No, I see.
Can I just come in there again? Because we've worked these lays really hard on the Cotswolds with lots of calcium, which really favours legumes, and not got to a situation where we've been over dominated by legumes. Like the older lays are still by far the most productive. We'll only be running 30–40% legume at best, but when you get soil ecosystems really firing well, you can get a lot of free living nitrogen fixers, which will actually fix more nitrogen than what clovers will, feeding off sugars off grasses. And where we've been trying to boost production, especially over the last 5 or 6 years where we've had very little slurry, things like applications of molasses, even as low as sort of 10 litres a hectare early season, has far more beneficial effect than early nitrogen, and helps kickstart the season, but has a long effect over the whole of the season. And it was quite a useful one to use coming out of droughts as well, where there hasn't been much sugar fixed by the grass as growth slowed. As soon as we've got that moisture, just giving the whole system a kick and firing the biology up really helped for the rest of the season.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Related to that then, actually, I'll piggyback on that. Which herb species would you say persist best after 5 years? After a 5 year?
After 5 years, it depends how you work the sward. If you create areas of compaction, grazing in wet weather and such, like chicory will stick there for quite a long time. We've seen swards where later on we get quite a lot of yarrow developing, and the plantain will stick in there for a long time. It tends to be the chicory and the plantain will hold on. Some of our soils seem to really suit yarrow for some reason.
Brilliant. No, that's great.
I'd agree with the. Sorry, I was just going to chip in from the sites that we've managed. Yes, yeah, so certainly the yarrow seems to be been doing well. Most of our sites have been medium textured soils. Few light, few medium, not so many heavy soils. But certainly the plantain, chicory, yarrow have done well. And then of course you need to think about the soil pH. So up in Northumberland, where we've got the swards going in there, farmer James Drummond very keen on the sainfoin, but on his soils, which are a little bit acidic, it doesn't tend to persist so well, which is why he's interested in the bird's foot trefoil. So he's hoping that will persist better on his soils. That's the hope. So it's very important to think about the soil texture. So you light land or heavy land, and then also the pH is very important from a persistency point of view. Yeah.
I see. I see. No, that's brilliant. I think that answers that. We go off in all sorts of directions here with the questions, but I'm gonna keep asking them as they're coming in. I'd like to just put one to Hannah here, just about how many hectares of herbal ley would you need to equal the carbon sequestration of 1 hectare of trees? That is a piece of string question, I know, but just interesting to put that to you.
I would have to look that up. I don't know.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay.
I
had to ask.
Can I just chip in on that one? Because
Yes.
there's this huge thing where if we need to sequester carbon, we have to go for trees. Trees are great. They sequester a lot of carbon, but they store it in the timber. If that timber is then utilized as wood chip or something like that, you're putting it straight back into the atmosphere. Whereas grasslands actually sequester that carbon into the soil, which is where it belongs, and have a huge potential to do that as well, and seem to get overlooked on a regular basis.
Okay. No, that's an interesting point.
Yeah,
I think you also need to think. I think you also need to think about the type of woodland, so and coppicing. So if you use coppicing methods, you have a chance to sequester more carbon than an uncoppiced system. So, and also the rooting depth, and whether you're using the land for timber, and also hedgerows. So, for example, if you don't cut your hedgerows every year, but every 2 years, you have the capacity to sequester a lot of carbon. So I'm involved in a natural capital project, which is looking at all these sort of different aspects that, you know, the general goal is not to replace herbal leys or pastures with trees. It's to take unproductive areas in the corner or the margins, or to look at fences and look at where hedgerows can be put in place. That's where the carbon sequestration can be gained as far as trees are concerned. And it comes back to the share or sparing debate. You know, do we spare land for these sort of ecological gains or environmental gains, or do we try and incorporate it in a herbal ley? And in a way, I don't think you can really compare herbal leys carbon sequestration with the value of sequestering carbon in the form of hedgerow trees. They work hand in hand, and you know, as a farm, you need to look at all those different options together.
Lovely. Thank you. I'll go back to well, I think this is a combo between Rob and Hannah. Actually, I think it's all of you. Is there any difference in bloat incidence in cattle when rotationally grazed on either grass, nitrogen-based swards versus multi-species swards?
I'm happy for Rob to start, and then I can add to that.
I'll follow on. I think the most important here is getting the plant physiology correct. Bloat is primarily caused by an excess of ammonia gas. If the plant is physiologically correct, it will be building that ammonia up into protein. If that's happening, then you have a much less tendency for bloat. But at the same time, when you're looking at other plants in the herbal ley, you've got plants which are rich in tannins, and tannins are great for mopping up excess ammonia in the rumen and carrying it through the animal in the dung rather than it being excreted as urea through the kidneys and urine. And that's a much more stable way of sequestering nitrogen and keeping it in the sward. So, you know, from experience, we ran into a bloat issue just as we converted to organic. And then I actually applied 100 kilos a hectare of salt across the whole farm. And after that, I think that balanced up the sodium potassium levels in the forage, and that solved the issue. Prior to that, cows would take lump rock salt like it was going out of fashion. Since that one application, they really stopped taking lump rock salt, and that application was put on about 10 years ago, and it's still the case today. So I think that combination of balancing the nutrients, utilising the nitrogen that's in the sward, and having those tannin-rich plants in the sward as well, very much, makes it a safe thing to graze.
Brilliant, Hannah.
As part of the TOMS project, we're doing some micronutrient analysis of plantain and chicory and yarrow. Kind of early data yet, but there is a hint that chicory is relatively high in sodium, which will sort of support Rob's point on that. Still early days, so that's interesting potentially in the future. Just as far as bloat on farm and with the farmers that I've worked with, some farmers are incredibly relaxed about bloat. They're not worried at all. They haven't experienced it, and other farmers just won't go near some of the Herbal Leys just because the bloat is such a worry. And there's a whole spectrum there. With bloat, there's a genetic element. Some stock, some cattle are just prone to it, and they always will be. And then there's an environmental factor, and then there's something slightly in between. So stock that are overwintered with a silage or whole crop ration are less likely to get bloated compared to those that have got a concentrate dominated ration, and this is potentially due to the change in the microbiology in the gut of the stock. So those go from concentrate straight onto a rich sward are much more likely to get bloat. The second part is introduce stock slowly and make sure they go on when the sward is dry. So some of those bloat inducing chemicals are water soluble, so a wet dewy sward will actually enhance the problem as well. And finally, if stock are introduced to Herbal Leys, it's better they stay on Herbal Leys rather than switch between a sort of simpler ryegrass sward and then going back onto to Herbal Leys. But it's always a case of be very vigilant and just know your stock and your system.
Lovely, thank you. So the next question, and for the listeners out there, we've still got most of you on here, so I'm just going to go over by another 5 or so minutes, if that's okay. Is there, so to Paul, I think, is there any evidence that nitrogen in multi-species herbage is better utilised by the ruminants, CF grass-only herbage?
Evidence that it's better used by the ruminants. I don't know of any, but in terms of whether they actually use the nitrogen better, Hannah might have an idea.
Over to you, Hannah. Thank you.
In the grazing trials that have been done as part of the SARIC project at CEDA at the University of Reading, comparing a paddock-based system, 2 years, steers across perennial ryegrass fed with 250 fertilised with 250 kgs of nitrogen, compared to those 3 other diverse Herbal Leys, the daily weight gain did not significantly vary between those different systems. So, which is quite interesting that the perennial ryegrass, the 250 kgs of nitrogen extra cost was wasted money when compared to the Herbal Ley. So that's just sort of basic growth data that's coming out, and there'll be more nitrogen data as it's being produced within the next year.
Brilliant. No, well, that's great. And actually related to that, there's quite a few questions about cost and considerations on cost when planning Herbal Leys. So it'd be great to hear what some of the considerations are when planning a Herbal Ley and the costs. So I suspect Rob has a some direct knowledge of that, practical knowledge on what you're doing, Rob, but I'm also keen to hear what everyone's perspective is on that.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started growing Herbal Leys back in sort of 2005, I was persuaded by Ian Wilkinson at the time to take the cheapest Herbal Ley, which was stripped down Lamins mix at that point, because that was the cheapest one and the closest to the cost of a ryegrass clover ley. on the back of seeing what happened with that, and the more I read and learned, I gradually increased the number of species until for about the last 5 or 6 years we've been fairly settled on a 20 species mix, which has so 9 or 10 grasses, 5 legumes and 5 herbs in it, and pretty much all of that grows, establishes and does a good job. And I think that seems to work well for the farm, and I think it's worth its money because it is considerably more than what a ryegrass clover sward would cost, but it's going in for 5+ years and producing forage that a ryegrass clover sward wouldn't do on the farm that we're on. So yeah, it's definitely money well spent.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Over to you, Hannah.
So seed cost is quite often highly prohibitive as far as trialling herbal Leys are concerned, and also it can be quite confusing when you're looking at a whole range of different species that you've never come across before. So there's kind of 2 methods that you can use if you're just starting off and you need convincing and you just want to do a couple of fields to see how it goes. Just from our trials, I would recommend just going with 4 species: white clover, plantain, chicory and ryegrass. This is assuming it's a sort of medium soil, not particularly dry, not particularly wet, and just getting used to handling the grazing and the cutting of that ley, particularly in how the chicory behaves and when it bolts and such like. So that's one option to increase your confidence. Another way is to cast your net really wide and to go for a 30 species mix, for example, the one that Rob probably is using, and to use something like an identification key. So as part of the TOMS project, we're developing an app which is it'll be out within a couple of weeks, where you can actually monitor the species on your sward. So it will help you identify the species and you can see which ones are dominating within your sward. So you know that actually on your soils, under your conditions, you may only need to buy a seed mix that's got 12 species in it, and you may not need to buy 30 species. So there's kind of 2 options: either go with a simple 4 species or potentially cast your net wide and then do some botanizing and identify what you've actually got in your field. So, and as far as the farms are concerned, as far as costs and additional costs are concerned, and I don't come across it mentioned very much, is it 2018, which was incredibly dry, the farmers I worked with didn't have to buffer feed on their herbal Leys, and they did have to elsewhere, and that doesn't quite often come up in costings, and I think it's quite considerable. And often we talk about herbal Leys looking at digestibility or protein, and actually those farmers I was working with were just pretty glad they had some forage. They weren't particularly worried about a 2% drop in digestibility under those conditions.
Excellent. Lovely, and thank you for that. So it's still related to cost, I guess. We do have a farmer who they're struggling to grow lucerne and samphoin without adding tons of lime every year. Is there anything that can be done? I suspect that's a question for Paul.
No, well, if they're on a naturally acidic soil, then I wouldn't try and fight against it too much. Right. So try and select species that are more adapted to the soil type, really. As Hannah and Rob were saying, so if you go for a range of species that are more adapted to your soil type, so if you're lower pH soil, then for example bird's foot trefoil might be better than samphoin, for example, and then think about what you're trying to achieve and what the future is for that sward. So you might want to start off with quite a high herb content, but then make sure that in the background there you've got some species that will persist into the longer term. So you've got grass, clover and maybe plantain, which will be there and still provide a productive sward even if the herbs don't persist after the year 3 or 4.
Lovely, thank you, Paul.
Can I just add a comment to that one? Sorry.
Of course, please do, Hannah.
So with each of the legumes, they've got to have a partner bacteria, so one of the rhizobia species, and not all rhizobia species will partner or form a symbiosis with the legume species. So in the UK, we can be pretty confident there's naturally occurring rhizobia for white clover, but on many, many farm systems, about 60% there are not the rhizobia that will partner with lucerne or bird's foot trefoil or sainfoin potentially. So I had a student who worked on this, and if your pH is in the right range for lucerne, so you need to be 7 is ideal, you could probably cope with 6.5 if you're lucky. Make sure you buy your seed inoculated with rhizobia. So because the bacteria won't be present in the soil, and acidity is really important with rhizobia. If your soils are quite acid, so I'm thinking about pH 6 or below, rhizobia that are not native, like the sort of trifolium ones, they will actually die, and every time you resow, you have to include your rhizobia species as well. And it's the student, a PhD student who I worked with, Rachel Roberts, she actually found that even the productivity of clovers can be enhanced by adding appropriate rhizobian inoculum. So we work with Legume Technologies, and they produce very cheap rhizobia, which can have a massive effect on the performance of those legumes, particularly, and lucerne was one of the study ones we looked at.
Lovely, lovely.
Yeah, I'd agree. pH is very important. And, you know, as I said, don't fight against natural conditions, but you do need to try and keep the pH up for your legumes. So you might have a soil that's naturally pH 5 or even lower. You need to be at 6. So, you know, regular liming is very important on those sorts of soils.
I see. But yeah, I guess that's another cost consideration. So absolutely. I'm going to keep you to 2 more questions now, and then we've just got 1 poll, and then we'll pull that to a close. So another one for Hannah. If elms option cover herbal Leys but require leaving the sward to flower for pollinators by not grazing or cutting, which period is best to let it flower, early, mid or late season?
Okay. So first of all, with elms, and before I answer your question, there's highly likely to be 2 options related to herbal ley. So at the moment, there's the GS4, which is based on income forgone if you put your herbal ley in an arable rotation, which is why it's quite a lucrative subsidy, but has all these restrictions based on it. And then there's likely to be an alternative elms option, which is just going to be for grazed herbal leys, which isn't going to have the closure time restrictions. So to answer the question about closure times, I think the best option is to quite tricky, really. It depends on your system and where you are. In a sort of wetter, warmer climate, I would say take off your good cuts of silage, get your productivity right, and then leave it open from there. So shut it off there, sorry. So you're looking at sort of June time. But then if there's options as far as hay is concerned, which may be an interesting intervention in the future, you'll obviously shut it off a bit later in the season. So it's quite a difficult question to answer. I think chicory becomes more unmanageable as the season gets on. It becomes more woody and bolts more quickly. So Rob had his hand up. He may be able to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Hannah. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, by the time you get to sort of late May, a lot of the clovers and herbs are wanting to head anyway, wanting to flower. And really from that time onwards, even if we're only on a 25-28 day rotation through June, a lot of those herbs will come into flower. And for the rest of the season, you can graze on a 35 to 40 day rotation and have constant flowering for the whole of the year. So it's not case of needing to specifically shut it up. It's just putting the rotation to the right length, and there'll be clovers, trefoils, chicory flowering for the rest of the year as we're grazing it, producing plenty of feed for pollinators.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. I'll ask the last question. The last question I'm going to ask today, and everyone's made my job extremely hard by asking so many good questions. So thank you for that. The question is, how do you explain the weed suppression effect of diverse sward versus binary grassland? And I'll let anybody put their hand up on that about weed suppression. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, the photo that was shown had thistles in it. We've had years with thistles, years without. The big issue with thistles is creating compaction. If you create compaction in a field, you will get thistles usually about 18 months later. Topping them once they're in flower in July, early August, tends to lessen them quite substantially. And looking at that sward where you've got the herbal one side and the ryegrass the other, you've got a tighter sward, tighter soil under the ryegrass sward, and a much more open soil under the herbal, especially with the chicory roots in there opening soil up. So then you're less prone to get weeds, because weeds paint a picture of what's actually going on in the soil. Taprooted weeds like thistles, like compaction. It's the same as docks do.
Lovely, thank you, Rob. Hannah, you've got one last point on that.
And just to support Rob's point there, when I assessed that trial, there was significantly more worms in that herbal system than in the ryegrass. And I should say that that wasn't a strip grazed field, and it was organic dairy grazed. So there was no differentiation between the amount of compaction. So any relief of compaction is just due to the rooting systems, which Rob's mentioned.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm afraid that that draws us to the end of the questions. I've still got a load of unanswered questions. I know that a lot of those questions were on establishments, and a lot of those will have been covered in the previous Herbal Leys webinar, which you can find on YouTube. If you've got a problem finding that, do email us and we'll send you the link. But I'll talk to Sue-Ann and Chloe about making sure that the links to all webinars are sent out afterwards. And anything on feeding and grazing, we've covered a little bit today, but they should be covered in the next webinar in March, which you'll all get an invite to. In the meantime, I know we're losing a few people now. We got below the 100, so I'm going to ask the poll here. I know we've overrun. After hearing this discussion, we're really keen to know the answer to this. After hearing this discussion, how do you feel towards growing Herbal Leys? So if you could tick which of those is most applies to you, I'd be really grateful. And as always, both ourselves at AHDB and at, our friends at BGS, we're always keen to get questions or answer questions, certainly about what you might need or any information you need, and it does help us to put this type of digital output together. So always keen to know. So that's fantastic. We've got more than half of you are likely to grow, and more than a third are already growing. So that's fantastic. So I'm hoping that we've added at least something to our fantastic speakers have added something to the knowledge out there. So it's thank you from me, and I'll hand back to Tom Goatman just to round up, if I may.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so a great amount of information we've covered this evening. So I was just going to pull out a couple of points from each of the presentations. So firstly, from Hannah's initial presentation, just outlining some of the benefits of Herbal Leys in terms of nitrogen fixation and reduced nitrous oxide emissions, and also improved soil health benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, particularly down to greater depths of 30 to 50 centimetres. Then moved on to Rob, and Rob also highlighted the improvements in soil organic matter with those the pictures there that we saw of the 12 inches of an evenly dark soil. And Rob highlighted the key to building that soil organic matter is understanding and optimizing photosynthesis in terms of leaf area and maximising the capture of sunlight, and then ultimately turning that into capturing that carbon into the soil, creating ecosystems, and then benefiting from the production advantages of that. Paul highlighted the need to understand that different soils types have different abilities to capture carbon, and again also highlighted in terms of the long time scales that we're looking at when we're looking at building soil carbon. He also highlighted that grasses may not act as a perpetual carbon sink, with that data there showing a plateauing effect in that experimental work. And the greatest potential may be in arable systems in terms of improving the soil carbon content with multi-species swards. Hannah then, in her final presentation, discussed the wider benefits of multi-species swards, and particularly in relation to pollinators, and particularly highlighted the benefits in terms of providing an early and late season food resource for pollinators, which is very important, and also highlighted the benefit in terms of worm populations, and linked to that in the final part of the discussions there in terms of weed suppression, in terms of getting that there's a better root structure there and helping in terms of weed control. So there's lots of points covered there. So there is a recording of the webinar tonight if you'd like to go back and catch any the discussions again, to just go over a few of the points. But I'd like to thank Rob, Paul and Hannah for their time tonight. It's been really useful and a lot of good information covered. So it's been fantastic, and particularly thank you to Hannah for stepping in at the last minute to help with that first presentation. So thank you very much, Hannah. Also thanks to Steve, who also stepped in at the last minute to facilitate the discussion tonight. So that was a great job, Steve. And also Chloe and Sion, who are working hard behind the scenes in terms of the technology. Just as a final few points before we close, I'd just like to highlight that the fourth webinar in the series will be on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, where we'll be focusing on feeding and grazing management. So as Steve said, there'll be a diary invite sent out regarding that. And I'd also like to just highlight the 2021 BGS research conference on multi-species swards. So this was supposed to take place in March 2020, but due to COVID, we were unable to complete a face-to-face event. So it will be held online now in the week commencing the 1st of March. And the sessions we're looking to cover will be establishment, sward management for grazing and conservation, and utilising and feeding value. So please keep an eye on the BGS website, where we'll post further information and details, and we'll also highlight when booking opens for that. Finally, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending tonight's webinar. I hope you found it all interesting, and I wish you all a good Christmas and a better 2021. And with that, we'll sign off for this evening, and hope to see you all again in March for the 4th and final webinar in the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.